Welcome to the Book of Urm, Chapter 12. They are rising. They are rising. They moved on from their morning camp and the near-calamitous attack by the strange shape-shifting water horses of Loch Anham Riotha, the Lake of Frozen Time, also called Baal Enatar na Hygroista, lair of the Infinity Serpent, according to the sprites at the Pool of Vioyen. As the sun began to set behind the trees on the other side of the lake, they moved silently in a lightly forested area where the trees were spaced apart, but large roots and boulders breaking through the grass and soil still made their footing uneven. Karui and Piecora set about looking for a place to camp, as Serpendis and Venexi sat down at the base of a tree, looking out at the lake while keeping a safe distance from it. It was humid, and long violet shadows drifted across the calm lake from the trees on the other side. A leaping fish of dazzling, shimmering colors broke the water's surface, while large hunting dragonflies flitted just above the lake's shores. Serpendis caught sight of a large serpentine ridge with a tall dorsal fin of iridescent opal, divided evenly by erect, bony spines. It quietly resurfaced before dipping back down, barely making a wave as it hunted in the depths below. "Can you devilkins see at night?" asked Serpendis unexpectedly, watching the dusk slowly descend over the bright clarity of the earlier day. "Like the elves? Or dwarves, so I've heard?" "No," Venexi said flatly. "Ah, that makes sense, I suppose," said Serpendis. "You're human, after all. Well, half-human, progeny of devils from long ago, from what I've heard." "We do not like that name, by the way," Venexi said flatly, with a sinister edge to his voice. His harsh, consonant-heavy Unskavian accent gave the warning extra presence, as if the language itself was born from hardship as a dialect of ancient Muthan. "Not from you. It's allowed among us as sort of a dark comedy that we share together, a kindred insult that we say to each other that strengthens our bonds, like siblings. But when we hear it from others, outsiders like yourself, it's an affront. You cannot possibly know its full meaning, what it means to us, what it represents. You have no right to it unless to insult us deeply and display your ignorance. We cannot help what we are, and we cannot change who we are. That is something only the Unskavians share together, and you are not privy to it." Serpendis held out his hand as if fending off an unseen attack, reminded of how little he knew of Venexi. Immediately he was flushed with the shame of assumed familiarity between them, even though they only met late the previous night. "Forgive me, lad. I'm an old dotard and I misspoke. I wish I could reel everything back in that I just said. I shan't use that word again. Coast Haveners have many names for people without their consent. We have slang for everything, you know, and our humor is biting. We laugh at the expense of others. A man gets a fishhook caught in his eye, and we laugh until someone has the sense to patch him up. As a merchant, I can tell you a few words that I'm called, certainly without my consent." "How do you know about us?" Venexi asked quietly. Again, Serpendis was surprised by his directness, realizing how far he had misjudged the lad from his behavior when the first met. How silly of him to think those few hours last night were all Venexi's character had to offer. Serpendis thought a while before answering, sorting through his thoughts. He wasn't sure how far he should go with his answer, but after deliberating over their current predicament, he found that telling the young Unskavian the truth would be harmless. And besides, the boy deserved to know, after everything he had been through even before coming to the Fey realm. Serpendis said, "I'm a member of a guild in Coast Haven, a secret one. Velastrum Tapetius, the veiled tapestry, the covering carpets, the hidden weavers, and so on. To pass through our organization is to go under the carpets, you see. He made a hand gesture as if he were sliding it beneath something. "We exist to help those who escape Muthan thraldom, namely Unskavians like yourself. They come into Coast Haven, and we pass them along to their new life." "Where is that, usually?" Behnke asked. Serpendis continued to detect something subtly toxic in the boy's tone, something accusational. Serpendis wondered if Behnke had reached his limit at this point from his tribulations so far, being held with his betrothed in a merchant ship's bilge for weeks, while sailing over the salt sea to Coast Haven, to then be thrown into a cart and carried to unknown lands, to wind up here and think he reunited with his girl, only to find out he was tricked by creatures of the forest that nearly took his life. Now he's demanding answers and trying to somehow piece together remnants of his broken sanity. Serpendis didn't blame him one bit for his foul mood. Serpendis sighed, resolving that he would just answer whatever Behnke asked, hoping it would satisfy him and earn his trust. "Beyond our borders, if we can help it. It's agreed among us that Kananaya is not a good home for you, so we try to expedite you as quickly as we can outside of our country, and from there you are free to go wherever you like. Canonians are afraid of you, for some deeply rooted fear that they don't quite understand. It's as if, when confronted by an Unskavian, something stirs within them, some kind of darkness. It's in all of us, even I feel it to a degree. You're a monster to them. Thus Havaners call you Devilkin because we are callous and ignorant. But many don't even know you exist, so rarely you appear in our streets. It's our job to keep you out of sight and get you out of the country safely and quickly without raising any attention." He added hesitantly, "There is a lot of money that can be made collecting heads such as yours. Bounty hunters on both sides, as well as freelancers on their own. Oh, they know about you too. It can be said that once you taste freedom, you may realize it's safer back in the district." Serpendis paused to let this all sink into the young Unskavian. "I'll tell you why I'm in on all this. I may not know your history, but I surely know about the district. I've been there once, and I'll never forget it." Serpendis gazed distantly over the lake, lost in his own memory of his visit to Eindungzirk, the Unskavian district of Norshlan, capital city of the Muthan Peninsula. He remembered walking down its main, cobbled, uneven street, Strassadøyhullen, or the Path of the Hells, his sandaled feet bending at odd angles over large, round river stones mortared closely together. Overhead, many long banners and tapestries dyed in brilliant colors fluttered in the chilly wind against dark, leaden clouds like waterborne serpents swimming against strong currents. Smokes of various colors billowed from congested stalls and open doorways on either side of the road, bringing scents he had never breathed before, each one more exotic than the last. He walked through one thick, dark, musky cloud of sweet-smelling maple and into another rolling wall of deep umber shadows and bright golden glints of vapor laced with the scent of strong curry and sea salt, only to then find himself in a hot, crimson steam, thick with cinnamon and saffron, that tantalized his sinuses. He ate the honey-coated seeds of a pomegranate speckled with shaved ginger as he slowly strode down the thoroughfare, while drinking a large, hot, clay mug of the most luxurious coffee he ever tasted, a thick, black, heated syrup infused with a tightly rolled strip of vanilla bark, prickly cloves and fine black seeds, crushed almonds and mountain salt. It was meant to be sipped, as its potency was rumored to give someone hallucinations, amnesia, and sweaty shakes, and if consumed too quickly, it would burn a hole right through the gut. The drink was called Tyfusbluth, or devil's blood, and it could only be found in the district where only a few Unskavians knew its recipe or how to brew it properly. The music. Even now, in his later years, the music of Unskavia rang in his ears from instruments not seen anywhere else in the world, from intricate rhythms on various drums and rattles and bells, to lush strings strumming in hypnotic coordination, to flutes and pipes and reed whistles riding high upon deep, swelling bass tones on large instruments of stretched, water-soaked animal hides. Serpendis remembered watching as the musicians draw flaming combs across the taut, water-soaked skins to elicit strange, deep, unpredictable notes of chaotic harmonies masterfully held within the key of the overall melodies. The foods, the smells, the music, and the exotic people of Unskavia, all beautiful in their strange and exotic ways, all overwhelming to Serpendis's senses. Never before had he encountered such a deeply rich, cloistered, and self-aware culture as that of what his contemporaries in Coast Haven called Devilkin. He could be lost there for days and never notice it, and everywhere he went, the people smiled at him with their sharp, fangy teeth and wide grins, and they beckoned to him, offered their homes, their wares, and whatever other services of banality they provided. He learned on that trip how the Unskavian culture fills one with both self-loathing and wondrous fascination. He wanted to simultaneously stay forever and leave immediately. During that trip, Muthans must have viewed him as some innocuous dignitary visiting the streets of Eindungzirk from the upper channels of Muthan society, in secret from his family, his peers, and his otherwise mundane life. No wonder they called this place the playground for the Muthan elite. Wealthy Muthans used the Unskavian district as their personal hunting grounds, immersing themselves in the exotic pleasures and wares by the people they enthralled, only to return to their proper lives and safe communities with false stories about where they were. This was the extent of Serpendis's limited understanding of the Muthan-Unskavian dynamic. It so moved him that when he returned from his trip, his first priority was to meet with Rultin, the book dealer, to discuss joining Velastrum Tapetius. Not only did his heart ache for the plight of Unskavians, but by the gods' pity on him, the spices and goods and riches that he could turn around in Coast Haven. Considering hardly any Haveners knew of these people, nor of their beautiful works of art, food, and fashion, he could set his prices as high as he wanted. There were other merchants that sold goods from Eindungzirk, but none of them knew of Velastrum Tapetius and its potential access to Unskavian exotic wares. They all scrapped among themselves for whatever fell off the Muthan ships that came to Coast Haven. But being a member of Velastrum Tapetius provided him with a direct line into unquenchable Unskavian culture, and the lucrative potential was too good to pass up. Serpendis returned to the present and looked over at Vinexi, who seemed lost in his own thoughts. He felt heaviness in his own heart for the boy, but didn't quite know how to express it. Shame also gnawed at the back of his mind at how he exploited the Unskavian culture over the years, now that he had personally interacted with one on a much deeper level than just passing them from one hidden room to another, or one covered cart to another. He realized that he was no different than the Muthan elite, who preyed on Unskavian culture for their own satisfaction and gain. Despite what Haveners called these people, Serpendis suddenly saw himself as the real monster. He was lurched out of his deep and distant thoughts when he heard Piecora behind them say, "Come, get away from the lake. It's getting dark, and Karui found our new camp. Let's go before she completes the circle." They followed their Xianyan guide into a dark grove of trees, where Serpendis saw Karui already working at her strange rituals that provided them safety from the forest at night. He saw Siru's violet light blinking in and out as the panther spirit passed quietly behind the trees beyond the camp's perimeter. Hero was on the ground next to the small fire, with what looked like the remains of a large grey bird beneath his feet, plucking at it surgically. Serpendes mused to himself that if there were anything the bird lacked in this strange world, food was certainly not it. He realized that almost every time he saw Hero around the camp, the raptor was eating some poor creature he'd caught earlier, yet not once did he ever hear a struggle or even a squeak. Masterful hunter, he thought. Serpendes dropped his pack and laid out his bedroll as Piecora cooked their meal on the small fire. As he slumped down, he found himself musing over this tale he had found himself in, and how it surpassed even his most exaggerated stories to people at the markets in Coast Haven. He had been all over Canania, and even a few places beyond, namely Muth, Helicles, and Vodup, but these were business voyages with well-established shipping lanes across the Salt Sea, to places Canania traded with often hardly what might be considered exotic excursions. He would stroll through the markets of these distant and allied lands, buying cheap things made by local artisans to turn them around for a profit back home in Coast Haven. But he had never before ventured to Siena. The wild lands made the journey unpredictable. He'd spent years saving a portion of his wealth to finance the expedition that would finally bring him to the lands of the Horse Lords, until he heard rumors of a great elven people just beyond Siena, a little further to the east. The thought of being the first Canonian to meet with these Banwa and perhaps trade with them was too tantalizing for his ambitions to ignore. If I'm to disrupt my life as much as a trip through the wildlands and be away from my family for that long, then I shall make it fully worth it. Nay, more so, he would say to his peers, there is history to be made beyond Siena with the wild elves of the plains further east, history and riches. He sat on his bedroll and watched Piecora turning chunks of meat on a small spit over the fire, someone he despised at first, but now had both fascination and familial affection for. He ruminated over how nothing was currently guaranteed. Each day in this forest presented various new ways in which he could die. But his tale was far from over. He owed his life to Piecora and her Banwa friend in ways he could never repay them for, even if he had the means, and though he made light of the constant reciprocations of saving each other's lives nearly every day, secretly he felt the weight of his debts to them, building like a dark cloud he couldn't escape from. He wished he could stop measuring everything so transactionally and just take what was given and be free of his own calculating mind. But it defined him as much as any feature on his face. Thus, he could never find true peace with himself or with others, as there were always debts to be paid or owed. He also allowed himself to indulge in another line of thoughts tickling the back of his mind as he watched Venexi curl up by the fire, the seemingly defiant, superstitious gullibility of Coast Haveners, despite living in the most culturally diverse and dynamic city in Canania, rivaling even Alagost, the palace kingdom whose population was almost 100 times that of Coast Havens. Though not counted among the great 7 cities, Coast Haven was arguably the most strategically significant and economically influential city in the country. It lay at the brackish estuary where the mighty Angliruin River emptied into the Salt Sea, where all of Canania's shipping trade occurred. The Angliruin ran south through the very center of the country from the Crystal Sea in the north. Tall ships sailed up and down the Angliruin to various ports, including Alagost. Thus, every ship from far and wide that sailed to Canania first dropped anchor at Coast Haven. Crews would disembark and stay a night or two, trading wares and gossip, before heading upriver toward their destinations. Therefore, it was in Coast Haven where you would most likely encounter all sorts of strange people and customs from all over the world, and all news flowed through Coast Haven like threads on a spinner. As much diversity and enrichment as there was in Coast Haven, its local citizens remained superstitious, disbelieving and distrusting of anything that didn't look or act like themselves. Serpendus knew much of this was due to how dangerous the streets of Coast Haven were at night, as they became filled with all manners of creatures and crimes. Don't go out at night is a typical Havener farewell, and Haveners largely blame this on the constant flow of outsiders that fill their city each day. Thus it was exceedingly dangerous for the likes of Venexi to be in Coast Haven overlong, and why Velastrum Tapetius moved them through the city and out of the country as quickly and secretly as they could. Coast Haven was the place of choice to go into hiding for many with reasons to do so. Just as much, it was also a place one could be easily found, as word travelled more quickly in Coast Haven than anywhere else, and people noted and remembered appearances, especially those of the striking and eccentric people of Unscavia who escaped their human masters of Muth. Serpendus Endium, master merchant of Coast Haven, awoke to Piecora stamping out the embers of the previous night's fire while humming a low, distant Sienyan tune to herself. The morning was cool, and as usual with every morning in this forest, a thick mist lay around them. It was silent, except for the occasional bloop of something disturbing the water in the nearby lake. Venexi had just awoken as well, stretching and working out the aches in his joints and muscles from sleeping on the rough ground. A network of creases in his face belied the roots, sticks, and brambles he slept on. Karui stood like a statue at the edge of the camp, arms folded and staring into the mist. Serpendus suddenly realized he never saw her actually sleep. They each had some water and ate a bit of their rations in silence before gathering their things to continue their journey through the forest. When the mist finally cleared and Karui deemed it safe, she smudged out her protective ring of embers that surrounded their camp, stepped out, and left without looking back. Serpendus and Venexi hurried after Karui, and Piecora followed last with Hiero leaping from his branch and flying into the upper reaches of the forest. On they travelled for the rest of the morning as the sun climbed into the blue sky above. They focused on Karui's path as she navigated through thick undergrowth, wide ferns, age-old fallen logs, soft beds of moss, and upturned roots and boulders of the topsy-turvy forest floor, ducking under massive hanging vines and stepping gingerly over large entangled roots, mushrooms, and fungal growths lurking at the base of the trees. At some point in the middle of the afternoon, Serpendus surmised that the lake must be far behind them now, since he could no longer see it, nor feel its cool breeze. Otherwise, he had no bearing as to what direction they were heading in. He paused for a moment to catch his breath until Piecora strode up beside him. Then he said quietly between breaths, "You haven't the faintest idea where we are, do you, old girl?" "No time to stop, merchant," was all she said, while patting him on the shoulder as she kept walking. But he noticed, as she passed him, that flowers of many different varieties were now worked into her hair at the base of her antlers. She then turned and pushed a handful of petals into his hand, smiling wide. Even now, hopelessly lost in these strange lands, she seemed jubilant and relaxed. The gesture lifted his spirits as he placed the petals into one of his robe's secret pockets and continued walking. She reached back, grabbed his wrist, and pulled him in front of her, saying mockingly, in the crudest form of High Canonian he had ever heard, "Get thee forward, my lord, lest thee become dead weight for the rest of us." He turned back to jeer at her, one eyebrow raised high over his furrowed brow, squinting his eyes at the pain in his ears she had just inflicted on him. "There shall not be more of that," he quipped back to her in proper High Canonian, wagging a finger absently as he continued scrambling forward and tripping over himself over the treacherous forest environment. He then noticed where Piecora must have gathered her flowers, for now, here and there around him, he noticed little flowers of many varieties, sizes, and colors growing between the crevices and recesses of the upturned forest floor. Slowly raising his gaze, he saw the flowers gradually accumulate in the direction they were heading until he found Karui and Venexi far ahead of them, standing in a bright clearing of large, magnificent flowers of countless colors, shapes, sizes, and breeds, all growing as high as mid-thighs. When he and Piecora finally joined them, he looked around in wonder as they stood in a large area completely open to the warm sun, now high overhead. The ground flattened out here, unadulterated by the harsh and uneven floor of the ancient trees they had just emerged from. Instead, the clearing was covered in a thick blanket of tall flowers. The air was still, without any breeze, and the combined scent of the many different flowers was like an overwhelming perfume. Clouds of pollen floated lazily in the air. Spores, filaments, seedlings, specks, and motes all hung in the air, suspended in stillness, moving too slowly for the eye to notice. Bees of all shapes and sizes tended to the flowers, zooming and buzzing and floating and bobbing along, disturbing the floating spores in the air like rippling foam on a stagnant pool, paying no mind to the intruders whatsoever. Serpendis shielded his eyes with one hand from the blazing sun and the dazzling kaleidoscope of flowers all around him, and covered his mouth with the other, fearing he might breathe in some of the strange stuff hanging in the air. He heard laughter, and Piecora bounded past him toward Karui, gesturing with her arms in wide arcs as if joyfully presenting the flower-laden clearing to Karui. He saw Karui shrug her shoulders, chuckle, and look down sheepishly as if disarmed by Piecora's exuberance. Then she said something to Piecora and jogged off toward the middle of the clearing. Piecora turned back to Serpendis, smiling like a child, and with her arms raised high, she let herself fall backwards into the flowers. She landed with a soft thud as petals and pollen erupted around her, sending Venexi into a sudden fit of sneezes. Serpendis walked over to Venexi, who was bent over with both hands on his knees, putting his hand on the young man's shoulder. "Something not sitting right with you here, lad?" he asked. Venexi stood straight, wiping his nose, and said, "I think I prefer the shade. Too much sun here, and hard to breathe. It's a strange patch, I'll give you that. Almost like time left this place behind and forgot to bother with it. Imagine the soil content that produces such a garden." Serpendis mused aloud. He could feel the earth beneath his feet, damp, moist and cool, interwoven by the innumerable and delicate flower roots and stalks entangled with each other. Piecora sat up, her head and shoulders popping through the flowers and disturbing dozens of bees who strove to continue on with their business. "I've never felt such pure earth," she said, blowing flower petals from her face. Uprooted flowers hung from her antlers and her hair, soft as a cloud, and the colors are like a dream. "Remarkable lands these are, wherever we are," he said as Karui returned to them. She stopped next to Piecora and said, "We should find a place on the other side of the clearing and make camp, just within the forest, when the sun begins to set. Tomorrow when we set out, we should follow the flowers. I believe they will lead us to the other side of the forest and into Cynthia." Piecora gathered her knees up and wrapped her arms around them. "What makes us say that?" Serpendis asked. Venexi watched them all speak in Banwarese with confusion, a language he knew nothing about. Realizing this, Serpendis made it a point to translate for the Unskavian. Never in his days leading up to this adventure would he have predicted translating Banwarese to Low Canonian in his life. Hero buzzed close by them, flying low and fast over the flowers, kicking up petals in his wake. He gained some altitude while zigzagging over the clearing, flower petals spitting out here and there with each sharp turn. Piecora stayed seated within the flowers and stared ahead of her blankly. Hiero flew to the far tree line and then hooked right as if yanked by a string, following the edge of the clearing. Serpendis wondered if the bird even knew how to fly casually. Hiero went low again, staying beneath the outer branches of the tree line, and flowers zipped beneath him in a motion blur of every color imaginable. "Avraiv kutramichella vitratika," Serpendis heard Karui say to Piecora. It was a warning. "Bringing him back now," Piecora replied flatly, and immediately Hiero pulled up and looped around to return to the group. Serpendis watched in amazement as Hiero soared low toward them at such speed that within a blink he arrived, and was then past them. A moment later, a loud clap of colliding air trailed behind Hiero as he climbed high into the sky. Serpendis looked down at Piecora and noticed her staring straight ahead at nothing. He knelt in front of her and tried to make eye contact, even waving his hand in front of her, but her eyes were unfocused and seeing elsewhere, fidgeting slightly from side to side. "What do your eyes see, Sienyan?" he asked quietly, addressing both her and the raptor. "This clearing is larger than it seems to us at first," she replied. "It goes on and on in either direction, bounded on both sides by the forest." She pointed with both arms in either direction, but continued facing straight ahead. "Karui thinks it will lead us right into Cynthia." "Well, I cannot think of a more pleasant trail to follow than this," he said, standing up and briefly placing his hand on her hands, gathered around her knees. He then strode off in the direction that Hiero flew in, across the flowers and toward the opposing tree line. They reached the tree line as the sun was setting. Serpendis noticed that similarly to the edge of the forest that they emerged from, this side also had flowers growing into the ancient forest before giving over to the forest's trees and roots. "I wonder what caused this then," he said to himself, pausing and looking out at the clearing. Piecora stopped beside him and asked, "What was that? What is this place? What caused this field of flowers to grow? This sudden lack of trees? Don't you think it's strange?" he said. Piecora shrugged her shoulders. "Spirits only know. This forest is ancient, even in terms of the elves. It has endured many things. Who knows what could have happened here? Perhaps a giant laid down and farted for a full age, and the trees never recovered." That night, Hiero flew low over the flowering field beneath the sickle-white moon. On the other side of the sky, higher up and more prominent, the red moon crept upward at a quarter full. After making his final perimeter pass, Hiero flew into the camp just inside the tree line as Karui completed her ember protection circle. Siru lazed above them on a low branch, watching the open field of flowers, yawning sleepily. His violet glow was dimmer than usual. "Will be a dark night tonight," Piecora said, as she watched the two moons slowly track across the sky. The field was lit in a soft, pink ambience provided by both moons, but no light reached inside the forest. "Rubra Meluna is riding high tonight at quarter full, chasing away Alba Meluna, which hides from us. Thankfully, Viridra Luna is nowhere to be found, for now," Serpendis answered soberly. He could feel his scholarly sensibilities slipping away from him in favor of the astrological superstitions of the 3 moons that most Canonians felt. If the green moon was a bad omen, and the red moon brought uncertainty and chaos, the white moon was thought to bring good tidings, peace, order, kindness, and fellowship. Thus, when more than one moon was present in the sky, it always brought complications and uncertainty. He sat beside the small fire and watched Piecora gaze over the nearby field. Karui applied final exacting touches to her protective circle, and Venexi nibbled at bones from his meal. Hiero landed on a branch opposite of the camp from Siru. "How ghostly it looks now," Piecora said quietly, noting how the flowers took on an eerie haze and seemed to become unified in a singular non-color in the mixed moonlight. She folded her arms and rubbed her hands up and down as if receiving a chill. Serpendis casually threw his bedroll over to Venexi, then got up and strode over to the tree within their camp. "Here, we'll trade each night, lad. 'Tis not the harlot's demise, but it's at least something softer than the ground to lie on." "Thank you," said Venexi, as he unrolled it beneath him. "What's the—" "I'll take you there when we get back," Serpendis said, anticipating the question. "Softest beds in Coast Haven. You'll have earned a night there after all this. We both will." Serpendis settled down with his back to the tree and thought of the glass of wine and full plate of hot food waiting for him at the harlot, then immediately drifted off into a deep sleep. He awoke suddenly startled, a hand tightly covering his mouth. Someone hissed, "Quiet! They are rising." It was Piecora's voice. Her hand turned his head to face the clearing. There he could barely make out dark shapes moving in the clearing next to their camp, bathed in deep crimson and black shadows beneath quarter Rubrima Luna, now high in the sky. The campfire was out, and Serpendis could not guess how deep into the night it was. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he began to notice that the shapes were large, hulking, humanoid figures. Some stumbled about in the red haze of the flowers, others rose from beneath them. The figures were entwined with leaves, flowers, and tendrils that swayed as they slowly moved aimlessly in the clearing. Karui and Venexi crept over to Serpendis and Piecora, and they all crouched together. Hiero flies high over the field, and it is filled with movement, tree line to tree line, Piecora whispered. Karui said in a hushed voice, "I don't know who they are or where they come from. I was meditating when I first noticed them." "More deception from the forest?" whispered Serpendis. "I do not know," Karui responded. "I do not feel safe here, but I dare not leave the circle either. We must be very still and very quiet." They all watched in amazement as the figures meandered directionless in the clearing, never speaking or making any noise except for their shuffling feet and the brushing and swaying of plants and roots. Serpendis began to wonder whether they were even figures at all, or if they were all just part of one singular mass deception like the rabbit mimic, but on a grander scale. What if the clearing were all one interconnected plant or creature, and these figures, these shapes of people, were merely puppets being manipulated by a convoluted, organized root system underground as a ploy to attract prey? He thought about giant sea anemones that are found in the salt sea and the tricks they employ to lure sharks and other prey to their demise. His mind continued to race with possibilities until he felt a subtle tremor in the ground beneath him. It was faint at first, as he had no idea when it began. As he became aware of it, he looked around at the dark shapes of his companions around him, wondering if they felt it too. "Steady," Karui whispered close to him. Suddenly, the earth became fluid beneath his hands, churning and rising like seawater. He felt thin, soft tendrils flowing out from the roiling dirt, weaving and grasping around his hands and legs. "The circle is disrupted from within, from beneath," cried Karui. As she said it, something large rose up beneath Serpendis and broke the ground under him. He was heaved backwards, landing on his back, while a large, dry hand that felt like old, crumbling, flaking paint grabbed his ankle. Little tendrils coiled around his foot, an ankle from the grasping hand as it squeezed hard, bending Serpendis's ankle at an odd angle and sending sharp needles of pain all the way up his leg. Serpentis cried out and kicked as hard as he could with both feet, just as the night erupted in a single solid jet of flames before him, engulfing the huge, hulking figure holding his foot. Karui was just beyond the wall of fire, feet wide apart and knees bent, her arms straight down and her hands curled palms up. The heat of the fire made her appearance wither and shimmer within the tall flames, and through that ethereal haze, Serpentis saw her countenance as a mask of pure concentration. He realized that she had summoned the fire from the last vestiges of the protective circle, igniting the little embers that comprise the circle all at once, and she was standing in the center of it, which meant Serpentis was on the outside. "Run! The circle is disrupted!" shouted Karui, while spinning and sending pillars of flames at the invaders. As they caught fire, she pointed and swung her hands as if conducting an orchestra that surrounded her, taking control of the burning tendrils and vegetation with her own shamanic powers and sending them leaping to new foes. Serpentis' attacker released its crushing grip on his foot as it immolated within the flames engulfing it. He finally saw the forms of their attackers with bright clarity by the light of Karui's ring of fire, as large and muscular figures with bones and ribs exposed, some with bare skulls, others wearing rusted metal helms and broken pieces of armor and mail. One held a corroded sword broken in half, and another heaved a gigantic rusted axe with the haft rotted out. Their broken, mangled bodies were completely overtaken and intermingled by the flowers of the clearing, serving as musculature, joints, tendons, and viscera, holding them together. Serpentis realized with mind-numbing horror that these were corpses of warriors, ancient and decayed beyond recognition, held together by the roots and flowers of the clearing, moving and acting by some primal, unseen malevolence. Instantly, his earlier vision returned to him, the burning forest brought on by large, raging warriors of the long, distant past, and the beam of light that cleaved through the forest, leaving nothing in its wake. Time seemed to slow as it all came back to him in total silence, juxtaposed over the reality of the current events happening before and around him. He saw within his vision the white light, appearing only for an instant, annihilating everything instantly and leaving nothing in its wake, not even the trees. The clearing. It is the path of the light. His mind raged, teetering on madness while piecing his vision together. "The Hyalangorn!" he shouted. "The dead from the kindred war. They rise from their slumber against us. O gods! These lands are cursed from the wrath of Vioyen." He didn't even fully understand what he was saying as he watched in stunned terror the flower-entangled warrior corpses ignite as Karui's flames engulfed them. Serpentis saw Siru bounding through the flames and leaping from one attacker to the next as a glowing violet blur. Then, all around him, in the darkness beyond the ring of fire, he heard the ground moving, roots shifting, and more corpses emerging from the soil. He felt many large hands grabbing and pulling him this way and that. One grabbed his arm and yanked it hard, shooting hot pain from his shoulder across his chest and back. He dropped to the trembling ground and crawled on his hands and knees, having no idea where he was going except away from the fire. Looking back, he saw the fire was now reduced to little patches of burning underbrush here and there. He could sense the commotion and fighting still happening there, but it was all a blur in the darkness. All around him were stomps and thumps and crashes. Dirt kicked up and whirled in every direction. Sticks and roots snapped and flew in the air, and bodies landed all around him, only to be reassimilated by the writhing flowers. Chaos reigned, and his only singular thought was to keep moving. He was kicked, stepped on, and tripped over countlessly. He hurt all over, especially from his shoulder, his foot, and his ribs. He clambered over shifting roots and trampled undergrowth as the roiling earth continued moving beneath him. He navigated through writhing stalks of saplings and flowers, trying to latch onto him with all of his strength and speed, until, suddenly, he fell head over heels down into a deep depression. His momentum carried him rolling and flailing until he finally came to rest against the sprawling root structure of a giant tree. Slowly, he stood up to listen, and he heard the conflict in the near distance. But he had no bearing on what direction they came from, as he could barely make out anything around him in the darkness, and sounds generally traveled deceptively in the fey forest. From the inky night, a long, drawn-out scream quenched all other sounds, and Serpendis thought it might be Vinexi. It was followed by a loud, wrenching, tearing sound, like canvas being pulled in several directions at once. Before he could react, the vegetation around him was disturbed, slowly at first, but then a light rain came consisting of little drips and chunks and pieces of wet matter showering all around him. Standing there motionless for a few moments, Serpendis's stomach suddenly flipped, and he spun and ran into the very tree that caught him when he fell. Using it as leverage, he crawled around it as quickly as he could before breaking out into a clumsy sprint, where he tripped and fell, colliding with everything in his way. He was wholly consumed with fear and felt imprisoned within an inescapable nightmare. His feet left the ground as something caught him beneath the arms, and his momentum carried him swinging forward blindly until reaching its apex. As he swung backwards in a long arc, he never touched the ground. All around him was a soft, omnipresent sound, like the ambience of a trickling brook, or the reticulated hum of a large spinster's wheel, or the grinding of nuts and seeds by hundreds of mortars and pestles. He realized that he was being raised up into the air, and the thin twine beneath his arms caused his shoulders and ribs great pain. He began to struggle from panic, fearing that he had just run blindly into another horrible trap in the forest. "Help! Help me!" he tried shouting, but it came out as a groan due to the intense pain of his ribs and shoulders. Then he smacked painfully hard against the side of a tree. In the darkness, he had no idea how much momentum he had or how far he was swinging. The sudden impact was so jarring that it knocked the wind out of him. At once, his arms straightened, and he began to fall through the loop that held him in the air. But then, several other loops caught him around his legs, pulled tightly, and continued to pull him higher. "Gods, just let this be over," he wheezed softly, swinging limply upside down in the darkness. At any moment, he could impact another tree, but he didn't care. Finally, his knees hit something hard above him, and he felt little hands on his feet and ankles, slowly hauling him up. His left leg was numb from the pain of his broken ankle, and he was exhausted. He was rolled onto his stomach on a thick, soft moss with a sweet, malty fragrance. He felt dozens of little feet hop onto him, moving about and prodding him. They removed his knife belt, but he didn't care. He just wanted the nightmare to finally be over. All around him were little clicks and chirps and guttural belches that sounded like large insects, but the feel of the little hands and feet on him was soft and cool, with smooth skin, and the fingertips were bulbous, shaped for gripping and, curiously, mild suction. He felt a slight pinch in his neck, and then the nightmare finally ended. Thank you for listening to this chapter from the Book of Urm. If you enjoyed this reading, like and subscribe to our channel, and consider supporting us at the Book of Urm at patreon.com.